Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Bill Hamilton. It's an honor to welcome you to Kehillath Israel. And we're particularly grateful that Adam Sandel and Michael Sandel are here in conversation on a very important and timely subject, happiness, how to realize it, why it is so elusive in realizing it in today's world. I'm going to say a brief word about Adam and Michael and my association, my very close association with them and their family, and Kiku and Aaron and Lena, who is coming back in a minute. The last time I was here with the family, we were actually standing right here under Helena's and Adam's chuppah. They were married here back in August, and that stands on top of the fact that Adam became bar mitzvah here once upon a time. And not only that, but Michael was on the search committee that brought me to Kehillath Israel almost 30 years ago, 28, give or take. And I was recalling with Michael that when we were in the process of that search, he had just completed his second book. That book was called Democracy's Discontents, and there's a revised edition of it out on the table along next to Adam's. And this is Adam's second book. So there's something very powerful and personal about being able to hold this really remarkable intergenerational conversation. I'm going to introduce Danny Weinstein, who's a vice president of CJP. She's going to introduce our program today. I'm very grateful for that. And then Rabbi Mark Baker, the CEO of CJP, is going to close. So we're very thrilled to be offering this experience in collaboration with our fabulous federation here in Greater Boston. A few hundred of us are on our way to Israel a little over a week from now, and looking forward to that very, very much. Meantime, without further ado, I'm going to ask you to give a warm welcome to Danny Weinstein, who's going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Rabbi Hamilton. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm thrilled to have been asked to be part of this. We're in this moment in time where it's basically almost done with wintertime and kind of moving into spring. It doesn't quite feel that way yet. And we know that in this season of holidays, Passover, Ramadan, Easter today, people are kind of in that moment in time in the year looking for connection. They're looking for community. They're searching for that purpose and that opportunity. And, working for Combined Jewish Philanthropies, at our very core, we work to build a purposeful, vital, and inclusive community. And so hearing today about finding meaning, finding happiness is a huge piece of building community and connection in the work that we do. I'm very lucky. I get to work in our area of development at CJP that focuses on connection. In fact, the department is called Philanthropic Connections. And it focuses less on the philanthropic part sometimes and much more on the connection. Oftentimes, myself and members of my team will get a call from someone saying, I'm trying to find my people. I don't have community here. There's a gap in that area for me. And so our job is really to help them find their people. And we recognize when they're making that call, what they're really asking for is an opportunity to belong. They're looking for belonging, they're looking for friendship, they're looking for so much of what is discussed in your book. And as Rabbi Hamilton mentioned, in just over a week, I'm kind of geeking out, but thanks to the vision of our president and CEO, Rabbi Mark Baker, who you'll hear from, there are 300 of us going to Israel, which has been an undertaking of love, absolutely. Of those going, 100 are between the ages of 22 and 40. And most of them signed up not knowing anyone else, not knowing exactly what they were going to experience either before the trip or after. And when we read their applications for sign up, most of them noted that they are in fact looking for community. Yes, they want to explore Israel, they want to explore Jewish identity, but most often they wrote that they're looking for friends and they're looking for finding something more than what they have in their everyday. So thanks to 13 partner organizations, young adults in particular, working with organizations like KI, and thanks to Rabbi Hamilton, we have built a program that has allowed those 100 who are going to Israel and almost 100 more who aren't able to go to Israel to actually and actively find community. And this experience is not the end game, it's a launching point. And we're really excited to see where their communal connection comes in after they experience their time together. So the friendship aspect in particular of your work is incredibly powerful to me. So without further ado, I will introduce our two speakers here, where they will be in conversation with Rabbi Hamilton, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A. So forgive me for reading. I did not memorize your very impressive bios. Adam Adatto Sandel, did I say that right? AKA Professor Pull-Ups. I can't do a single pull-up, so I'm glad that you hold a record. Is a philosopher, award-winning teacher, and holder of the Guinness World Record for the most pull-ups in 1 minute. Author of the critically acclaimed The Place of Prejudice, A Case for Reasoning Within the World. He has taught at Harvard University. He is currently an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, New York. As I was just explaining, my entire family is from Brooklyn, just not the cool part. All right, and Michael Sandel teaches political philosophy at Harvard University. His books on justice, democracy, ethics, markets, and meritocracy have been translated into more than 30 languages. His course Justice, was Harvard's first to be made freely available online and has been viewed by tens of millions of people around the world. Very impressive duo we've got here. Rabbi Hamilton, thank you for having me, and over to you.
Thank you, Danny, very much. And let's have a warm welcome to Adam Adatto Sandel and Michael Sandel.
Well, thank you, Danny Weinstein, Rabbi Hamilton, Rabbi Baker, for convening us for this conversation. It's a thrill for a parent to be the student of his son. So I guess I owe Adam the thanks for that. And I'd like to begin by asking you a question about why happiness is so difficult to achieve, why it eludes us. And having read Happiness in Action, I know that it has something to do with a mistake, a flawed understanding we have about what happiness really means. And it's a familiar mistake. We all experience it. We think of happiness as achieving our goals, succeeding in achieving our goals. And if one goal doesn't satisfy us, we think, well, maybe I need a different goal. And I seek to achieve that. But the big teaching of your book, Happiness in Action, seems to be that that way of thinking about happiness, achieving our goals, is flawed. And so in telling us why it's flawed, I wonder if you could do it. Danny mentioned the pull-ups record. You write in the book that you came to this way of thinking about happiness in part by reflecting on doing pull-ups and competing to be the world champ, which is about as goal-directed an activity as I can imagine. So what's wrong with thinking about happiness as achieving goals, striving? And how did your own experience lead you to this insight?
Well, one thing that we're all very familiar with, I think, is how fleeting our goals are, that we anticipate some state of the world that lies ahead of us, that we're going to achieve. And once we're there, our life is somehow going to be better, or maybe even finally justified. You know, it could be a big social goal, or it just could be a personal goal, maybe a career goal, or something as small and personal as getting as many pull-ups as you can in a minute. And we put so much energy and even beat ourselves up over how close we are or how far we are from the goal, imagining that when we're there, we will have reached the promised land. But then I think what we also experience is when we do succeed, we maybe celebrate for a little while, you know, toast with our friends, glass of champagne. Maybe it lasts a few days, but sooner or later, we wake up, we say, hey, I'm the same person. You know, one more achievement in the hopper of achievements, but what now? What next? And we're back in the same position that we started from before we even identified this goal as the goal. So it's from that experience that I write, and it is a very personal experience because this pull-ups pursuit has actually been a process. It hasn't been a one-shot gain the Guinness World Record and that's it. But, you know, going back to 2015, I fought hard to get the record, you know, came up short once, finally broke it. This was when 50 pull-ups in 1 minute was the record. Some US Marine had done it, and he was like a ninja warrior guy. And yeah, I had seen him on TV, and he was impressive. But I said, you know, I think I can beat him. So I got to 51. And you can imagine how excited I was after all of this training. But not more than 2 months later, some Italian guy reached 53. And then some Bulgarian guy reached 54. And that was like 2 weeks after the Italian guy. So I said, wow, I'm back to the drawing board. Accomplishments are fleeting. And, you know, I've been going back and forth. I got 68 pull-ups, which was my greatest achievement. That too in 2020, it lasted for a couple of years, but then that too was taken down by a man from China. So he now has 74. And the more you do this, the more you realize, well, what really motivates me? What am I doing here? There is something that still motivates me, something I love about the activity of doing pull-ups. But it can't just be the records, the victories, because those are so fleeting. And if you take a broader perspective on time, like a really broad perspective, who knows 100 years, 1,000 years from now, whether the activity of hanging from a bar and pulling yourself up until your chin just barely clears the bar is even going to be something that people care about. You know, it's kind of a niche thing that even now, it's niche. It's not like an 100-meter dash. I wish that's what I excelled at, but it makes you think, and to put competition and success in a broader perspective, but then to ask yourself, well, what's really meaningful in this activity? And for me, as I reflected on this experience, but also thought about the books I was reading, because my day job is in philosophy. It was at the time, and even though I do something else now, philosophy is a big part of my life. I said, no, it's really about the journey. It's not the outcome. And I think that this is something on a certain level we all recognize as well when we say embrace the process, embrace the journey, don't get too hung up on the endpoint. But do we really live consistently in line of that ethic? You know, how can we appreciate the journey? How do we articulate why the journey is maybe even more important than the goal itself? Why the process of training for the record and all of the things I encounter and the qualities of character that I learned to develop in the course of that training transcend the actual result and last, stick with you. You know, the journey, the qualities of character is something you carry with you throughout your life. It doesn't just end when the competition is over. So that's what really motivated the book and what I tried to develop. What are the virtues of character through which we can come to appreciate our activity for its own sake and not simply for the sake of a goal?
Could I ask you about something other than a niche activity, your day job at the moment, which you referred to in passing? Philosophy is a long-term vocation. Your immediate day job is being an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn. How would you apply this way of thinking to the practice of law as you've experienced it in this job? That's not a niche activity. Someone might say, well, you just said, 100 years from now, will they even think hanging from a pull-ups bar matter? But they probably will think that upholding justice under law matters. So that's a big goal. Does your questioning of the idea that fulfillment and happiness come from realizing goals, achieving goals, apply even to a big goal like the one you pursue when you go to work every day now, upholding the law? Or is that too, well, how would you describe your critique of goal-oriented striving in relation to this job?
Well, in the domain of law, the tension is very stark between goal orientation and trying to find something in the activity itself that really draws you in and that you would find worthwhile, win or lose. Because being in the courtroom litigating is about winning. You know, if you're a district attorney, you want to present the strongest case you can so you can win, and the defense is looking to defeat you, to poke whatever hole they can in your argument. So it's a very adversarial setting. And it's very easy to understand what you do in terms of wins and losses. But if you get too caught up in that, it's just devastating, because you're second guessing yourself all the time. You become obsessed with the outcome, and what you lose is the learning process. That actually the toughest cases where you end up losing, but you did everything you could, that is often the most rewarding, at least in my experience, where you learn the most. Or even when things go totally wrong in unexpected ways that aren't your fault, like, you know, your deputy bureau chief will go say, all right, you got to go down and cover court. Well, it's 10:30. I thought court started at 9. Yeah, but, you know, so-and-so couldn't show up, so we need you to fill in, and judge will be okay with it. Say, okay. Go down. Morning, judge. This is not a good morning. You know, stone cold face. Like, oh man, I'm just going to have to be a punching bag for the next hour that I have to cover court and take all the calls. And it's a character building experience. I think learning to see our lives through a narrative lens, where even these situations that we're thrust into that are undesirable, very uncomfortable, can be the greatest occasions to learn and grow as a person. Self-possession is one of the virtues I discuss in the book, which has to do precisely with that. How do you respond to things when they don't go your way? It could be a loss, but it could also just be an unexpected difficulty.
Well, self-possession gets to the question I wanted to ask you next. If happiness isn't about achieving goals, one after the next, the question arises, what is it? And you've already given us a partial answer when you said it has something to do with finding activities that are valuable for their own sake, not as a means to something else. And in the book, you identify 3 virtues that, properly lived and understood, are valuable, are instances of activities valuable for their own sake: self-possession, friendship, and engagement with nature. Now, you've mentioned just now self-possession. When people think of self-possession as a virtue, I'm guessing, most of the time, we think of it as assertiveness, self-assertiveness, being confident, leaning in. But that's not what you mean by self-possession. What's wrong with the way we commonly understand self-possession as a virtue?
So self-possession can be distinguished, I think, from self-confidence. And that's very important to understanding self-possession as integral to appreciating activity for the sake of itself and not for the sake of a goal. Self-confidence, as I understand it, is feeling yourself capable in a particular domain. It could be, as a lawyer, being able to give a really good grand jury presentation. If you're a doctor, to fix a sick patient, or to give a really smooth sales pitch if you're in sales. And to get at this...
Advertising, you talk about Mad Men.
Yeah,
Give us that example.
So the television show Mad Men, I think, presents a really good example of this contrast in the protagonist of the show, Don Draper, who's this dapper, smooth-talking guy who is very adept at making pitches to high-stakes clients.
He's an ad man.
He's an ad man, so he's presenting advertisements and trying to get clients, and he's very good at it. And he's good when the pressure is on. She's very self-confident, but what the show reveals is that when he leaves the bright lights of his Madison Avenue office, his life spirals into this dissolute kind of existence where he drinks too much, he ends up cheating on his wife, never finding satisfaction, the spiral of alcohol and women and debauchery. And then every morning you see he wakes up all disoriented. His life is kind of in shambles, and this is captured in the very opening image of the show where he's in free fall. So you see this contrast of a very pulled together, confident person in public in a very narrow domain, which is admirable in its own right. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, if you're in his line of work, you want to look up to Don Draper. But then you see, when you look at his life as a whole, it's really a mess. So there we have somebody who has immense self-confidence but lacks self-possession. So self-possession, as I understand it, is a broader virtue. It has to do not so much with how you act in this or that circumstance where you feel comfortable or at ease, but the sense of self that you carry with you to every situation that you confront in your life. And there are many dimensions to it that we could discuss in greater depth, but having a sense of humor, a sense of lightness, not taking yourself too seriously, but at the same time understanding the things that matter most and being tenaciously committed to friends, to activities that are meaningful to you quite apart from the results that they bring. Learning to understand people around you, to see them not as threatening opponents if they disagree with you, but actually as people who may be confused in some way, but who you can reach through trying to understand their perspective and maybe even attempting to persuade them, but at least trying to understand them so that you don't go around the world feeling besieged by people who pose a threat because they think something different. We can talk about Socrates later, but he was a model of this kind of openness to a range of views. And what's remarkable about Socrates is he never gets angry. In all of Plato's dialogues, he's remarkably level-headed, maybe kind of a caricature of level-headedness, but that's self-possession as distinct from self-confidence.
You have some examples in the book drawing on your own experience about Little League Baseball in Brookline, and there was plenty of assertiveness by some of the parents, including some of the parents' coaches, plenty of assertiveness, self-assertiveness. But you write in the book, and I think you noticed even at the time, that didn't mean that they were self-possessed. Can you explain how that contrast was illustrated by some of those characters?
Yeah, this would come out all the time. Little League baseball, tennis growing up, it's a rough arena of life. And people don't fully realize that. There's a lot of competitiveness, a lot of parent coaches who are trying to relive the glory days that maybe they wish they had, and putting a lot of pressure on their kids. And it can be tough, and they're very competitive. But what struck me was coming across the occasional father coach who just took time to coach because he loved the game of baseball and he loved to see it develop among kids who were having fun with it themselves and who were improving as he coached them. And this was a parent who helped me out. I remember I was just throwing on the pitching mound with my dad, and he, I guess he had the distance of older sons, so he wasn't directly competing against us. But I do remember, and this struck me, was his kid was playing a game over on the big field, the high school field, and I was still on the 12-year-old field. And he came over. His kid was playing, and normally he'd be all over that, how's my kid doing, watching that game like a hawk. But he came over to our field, and because he saw me throwing on the mound with my dad, 12 years old, and said, "Oh, I can give you some pointers with your pitching mechanics." And I remember that to this day, somebody who was able to put the competitiveness in perspective and to appreciate the activity of baseball and the cultivation of the next generation of baseball players, quite apart from whether a team would win or lose on any given day.
Parenting is the broader theme here. Are pushy parents who set goals for their kids and push them to achieve success one after the next as they're getting ready to apply for college, for example. Are they failing to convey to their kids what a happy, fulfilling life can be?
I think it's such a tricky balance because unfortunately we live in a society where we do have to check certain boxes and meet certain standards in order to get into college and to be on track for the range of careers that are respected in our society and that bring us the material benefits that we expect. So I think it's very difficult to parent in that environment because on the one hand, you do have to instill some sense of getting things done and doing your homework and not blowing this or that off. But it comes at a great risk, I think, that goal-oriented attitude, first of all, diminishes education for its own sake. That education really should be about growing as a person, learning how to be, not learning how to get stuff. But I think the key is really in striking the balance, and I'm sure when I'm a parent that's going to be a difficulty I face. I find it hard to blame parents, but yeah, it can be excessive, and especially in a place like Brookline with such high achievers surrounding you all the time. You do wonder, are we putting too much pressure on our kids?
The theme that runs through the examples you've discussed so far, Adam, the philosophical theme has to do, it seems, with the intrinsic, values that are intrinsic, activities that are intrinsically valuable, by contrast with seeking one thing for the sake of something else, for the sake of something else. And you illustrate this very powerfully in the second virtue you write about, alongside self-possession, friendship. And with friendship, as with Donald Draper's false self-possession, with friendship too, there is a very familiar, lesser, maybe even corrupt, less valuable, instrumental version, whereas the intrinsic version, how does it work with friendship, this contrast you make between what's intrinsically valuable and what's merely instrumental?
Well, we all know of friends who aren't really friends, like our social media friends would be a good example. We count them up and display how many we have, but chances are most of them aren't real friends, except for the the buddy from high school who follows you. But you know what I mean, most of them aren't. So we already, to the extent we count and display and even begin to derive a sense of self-worth from how many we have, are falling into an instrumental conception of friendship. But also in our interpersonal relationships, it's very easy, and I've experienced this as I've grown older, to have a lot of people who are there for you to talk shop, or connections, work colleagues, who you have a more transactional relationship with, and who you end up spending a lot of your time with, who aren't real friends, in the sense that your relationship is only relative to certain shared interests, and that once those interests don't obtain anymore, the relationship kind of dissolves. And there's nothing wrong with those type of relationships, but I think there's something missing from them, certainly, when we lose a deeper sense of friendship. Sharing a history with someone, growing up together, knowing that someone else has my back and they have mine, telling stories together, growing in wisdom and self-understanding in each other's company. That kind of friendship is very easily crowded out by a goal-oriented attitude. And I feel it very acutely in my own life when the pressures of work, the work day, the work week, getting stuff done, leads me to say, well, I don't know if I have time to hang out with this friend, see this person I haven't seen in a while. They're a genuine friend, but I just don't know if my schedule is going to permit. And I try to catch myself, but it's hard. And this encroachment of the instrumental on the intrinsic is a real threat, I think, to our happiness. Because ultimately, when things are said and done, it's our friends and the time we spend with our friends, the people closest to us, that really matter and make our lives fulfilling.
And how can we know? It's one thing to notice that social media friends are not real friends. But is it always apparent with actual people we associate with who's a true friend and who's an ally or a transactional partner? I was thinking of the example in your book you give, being a tennis fan, of Federer and Nadal competing, a friendship forged in competition. How is theirs a real friendship rather than a merely a mere relation between competitors? And how do we know? What's the quality that we look for to know?
That's a great question, and it's so difficult to say. If you look at Federer and Nadal, you could easily interpret their friendship as instrumental. You know, you go to one of my charity events, I'll go to one of yours. But there's something deeper, I think, to the way they relate, and that is apparent when they're actually playing tennis, when they're in the midst of what they do, their characteristic activity, where Federer, with his incredible range of shot making, big serve, flatter ball, and Nadal's characteristic forehand, topspin, whiplash type of shot, and the way he grinds on the court, and just his muscly, fast way of playing, in contrast to Federer's kind of elegant, gliding, superhuman style. That when you see these two instantiations of tennis at the highest level playing themselves out in opposition on the court, you realize that there is a kind of friendship in the works as you're watching that match, because what each player is doing is attempting not only to destroy the other opponent or to hit the winner, but to bring the game of tennis out at its best. And I was struck after one match. I can't remember which one it was. It was a Federer and Nadal match, and Federer lost. And he said that that it was too bad that somebody had to win, but that what he really wished was that the match would never have to end at all. And I think that spoke to a kind of friendship with his opponent, a friendship who was united by the game of tennis and the love of the game, the desire to bring it out at its best. And that, yes, they were trying to one-up each other, but in that one-upsmanship, there was something greater at stake. It wasn't about either one of them, but the game itself as it was being enacted. And that, to me, is a powerful form of friendship for its own sake, because what he was saying is it's not about the win or the loss. It's about putting on a good show, tennis as it's meant to be played. So friendship and competition, I think that it's an interesting topic to explore. I touch upon it in the book, and I don't think friendship and competition are opposed. And I think actually in the closest friendships, there is an element of opposition, at least in terms of character types, kind of an opposites attract phenomenon, you could say, that when we look at friendship for the sake of itself, we look at two people and we say, wow, they have such different interests. This clearly isn't a relationship for utility. There's something that each appreciates about the other because that person represents something that the other may aspire for but isn't, and vice versa. And there's a kind of mutually empowering partnership.
I think we can sort of catch a glimpse of the connection here between friendship for its own sake and a certain kind of self-possession. When you were describing the scenario, it seems that there is a connection. I want to ask you about the third virtue that you associate with intrinsically valuable activity of a kind that leads to happiness. And that's engagement with nature. And I suppose it's parallel to self-possession and to friendship, and maybe even connected to them. In each of these cases, it seems, there is a familiar superficial form of a friend it's really transactional, of self-possession that is merely a kind of bravado. What about in the case of engagement with nature? We engage with nature when we go on a vacation to see some beautiful place and take photos of it. And I suppose post those photos on Instagram, tell our friends. Would this be an example of engagement with nature of the superficial kind? And if so, what's the real thing?
Well, I suppose I'd have to see what the photos look like. If they're well composed and thoughtful, maybe it is a deeper engagement, but engagement with nature, coming to understand the world that we don't make, but that confronts us, is somehow distant and our own at the same time. That's what I mean by engagement with nature. Learning to see the world not simply as a world that exists out there, independent of me, independent of what I think and do, but nor is it a world that I control or can bend to my will. And the ways we engage with nature on an everyday basis, going on a hike, going on a vacation to an exotic beach and taking photos of the palm trees and the white sand and maybe an image of us surfing, that it can point toward a deeper engagement, but I think often it's superficial. You go somewhere because you've heard that's the spot to go. You post it on Instagram to show your friends, hey, look where I was. In fact, you go there for the Instagram photo rather than for the place itself. I mean, that's a more superficial engagement with nature, with the larger world. But what about interpreting the things that strike you in your daily lives, the things that make you stop and say, wow, that's a beautiful sunset, or looking up at the stars, or you're going on a hike and suddenly you're in the presence of a roaring waterfall. And it's so impressive and it stops you in your tracks. And taking a moment to think, well, what is it about this natural wonder that's so beautiful, awe-inspiring? Instead of just photographing it and saying, hey, this will be a cool thing to share, what meaning does it have in the context of my life? What might nature in this unusual and striking form teach me about the way I live? Because anytime we notice something, we notice it for a reason. It's not just like we're idly looking around and fasten upon something and there it is. No, it has a meaning to convey to us. Nature has a message, but we are responsible for interpreting it.
For example, and you have some examples.
I
in the book.
have some examples. One that I went some years ago with my dad to see at the border of Brazil and Argentina, Iguazu Falls. It's one of the biggest waterfalls in the world. It might actually be the biggest in terms of the sheer amount of water that comes down what are they called? The cataracts or the cliffs. And it's really quite striking. And it's both violent and beautiful at the same time. And you see this quite serene water of the river at altitude, just kind of gliding along, and then it gets frothy as it nears the edge of the cliff and suddenly falls off. And you have this giant crash, and then it serenely moves on just as it was before. And I was thinking about it and thought, wow, what a great metaphor for life. And it wasn't just me thinking of these ideas. I think I was reading a lot of Greek tragedy at the time. So I was thinking about Oedipus and how his life falls into shambles after he does all of these terrible things that he doesn't realize, and how he's ultimately redeemed when the city of Athens accepts him. And I was looking at the waterfall and thinking about Oedipus and thinking about life, and said, wow, this has something to teach us. The way in which our lives may be gliding along as if our lives are the water at the top of that cliff, and suddenly, bam, it falls off unexpectedly. Disaster. And then the water regains its composure. It's a beautiful lesson for life and a source of inspiration. But we often miss that in our busy days. Something catches our attention, but we move on. But being able to dwell on things for a little while and interpret them, I think, is very important to achieving a sense of happiness, a sense of belonging in the world. So it's not only interacting with other people, friendship, but engagement with nature in this kind of way.
I soon want to call upon those who have questions or comments for Adam, but as people formulate their questions or comments, I wanted to ask, now that you've laid out the three virtues that, properly understood, are activities that can be valuable in themselves and therefore a source of happiness. What they have in common, it seems, is a certain philosophical orientation to nature, as you've just described it, interpreting nature. In the case of friends, a certain way of interpreting the meaning of the competition between these two great tennis players. Or in the case of self-possession, finding our way through self-interpretation to a certain stance toward the world, a grounded stance, not buffeted by goals or pressures that would lead us away from ourselves. Here's a short, easy question while people formulate theirs. What does philosophy have to do with happiness? In order to be happy, do we need to be philosophers?
Well, it depends what you mean by philosophy. If by philosophy you mean a student of academic philosophy, then absolutely not. And in fact, I think academic philosophy can detract from happiness quite a bit. And It's easy to overthink things, and it's also easy to get caught in merely academic questions that prevail these days a lot in philosophy, and that I think turns people off to philosophy as a field of study. But philosophy, the Greek origin of the term is love of wisdom. Philos is love, and Sophia is wisdom. So philosophy, the love of wisdom. Well, what kind of wisdom? Wisdom for how to live well. That's how philosophy was originally conceived in ancient Greece. So Socrates being the paradigmatic philosopher in this sense. And their philosophy meant discussing exactly the kind of things that we're discussing now. How to live a good life, how to achieve happiness, how to balance love of money, love of honor, and love of wisdom. And philosophy in that sense, I think, is inescapable. I think philosophy comes up whether we like it or not when we're facing a tough dilemma, thinking things through. We are beginning to do philosophy whether we realize it or not. So in the old-fashioned sense of Socrates, I think philosophy is inescapable and necessary for the good life, insofar as thought, reflection, dialogue is necessary for a good life.
Great. Should we see if there are people who would like to pose questions or offer comments? Yeah. Yes. Go ahead.
Anna, you have?
Yeah.
We'll have Randall, and then we'll go back
This
here.
is
Well,
Professor Randall Kennedy from the Harvard Law School.
Well, thank you very much. I love the book and love the discussion. Question I have is this. Did you ever encounter fear in writing this book? I mean, you're taking on a tough subject. It's a tough subject about which people all over the world have written. And furthermore, you're a young person. So in trying to take on such a tough subject, did you encounter an internal fear?
The fear, I think, was more associated with the risk of writing something personal and putting my own thoughts and anecdotes on the page, and exposing them, I guess, was the greatest trepidation that I had. But fear wasn't the prevalent emotion for me while I was writing this. Definitely angst over how I was progressing and writing it and all that, but fear less so. Maybe because I felt I had nothing really to lose, in the sense that I wasn't writing this for mainstream academia. And that was a decision I made early on. I think I might have been more afraid if I was thinking that this was going to be the book that got me a job in philosophy, as a tenure track professor or something. That was never the goal of the book. I think really it was the struggle. The greatest difficulty, honestly, was the struggle to articulate myself on the page and to think through the ideas and to try to live up to the questions that I was posing.
But can I pose a build on Professor Kennedy's question? The subtitle is A Philosopher's Guide to the Good Life. Did it never occur to you that that's something you should be writing in your 70s and 80s and not in your 30s?
Well, somebody once told me that once you're in your 30s, people start taking you a little bit seriously. So I thought that maybe it was right around the right time to try something like this. Aristotle would have probably disagreed. He said you shouldn't even start studying philosophy until you're in your 30s. So maybe he would have reproached me.
Who else? Yes.
Thank you for your willingness to speak to us about this. Do you have an opinion about the relationship between anxiety and happiness? Are they opposites? Are they adversaries? Is one a tool of the other? How should we think of them in relationship to each other?
Thank you, Bruce.
That's a great question. I don't think they're opposed. And part of the argument of my book is that difficulty, fear, anxiety can be the occasion for tremendous thought and personal growth. So I tend to think that a life without frustration, anxiety, deep concern is a life that hasn't fully confronted the deepest challenges and also doesn't open up the possibility of the greatest moments of enlightenment. So I definitely think anxiety and a good life are consistent. I think anxiety, too, it's an interesting concept to interpret because one could distinguish it from fear. Often what we call anxiety is a kind of fear in certain circumstances that we would like to control but have difficulty doing. But anxiety can also be interpreted in an existential sense, going back to what we started with. When we accomplish something and then we ask ourselves, well, what now? What's the meaning of my life? What's ultimately at stake in things? That, I think, is anxiety in a profound kind of existential sense. And I think it's those moments that are full of potential.
Nice. I know that you had a question. By the way, I am kind of curious, Adam, about the fact that Socrates never got mad. That actually is because we've heard about fear, we've heard about anxiety, anger. It seems to me is also something that is probably part of life. And I don't know if you have a comment about the fact that that anger never seemed to come across Socrates.
Well, Socrates, we have to understand him, I think, as a kind of ideal type or as a caricature. The Socrates that we know is the Socrates that Plato constructs as this figure who is almost superhuman, and that he never experienced fear, but was always able to. He was kind of like the wise man who anything you said to him, no matter how rude it was, he would kind of be able to smile and very calmly interrogate you. And I don't think any of us has that superhuman capacity, but I think what Plato was trying to show is that this is something we should aspire for.
Right, it's the way he's presented, probably not the way he was.
Right, and it had to do with his faith and philosophy and dialogue. I think that's the really important part. The reason he didn't get angry is because he attempted so deeply to understand other people that even in the face of the greatest opposition, he saw that as an opportunity, not as a threat. Again, very hard in practice to do, but that was the idea.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the talk. I was curious, a common critique of this idea of the life as a journey, right? Finding happiness through taking the time to dwell in the moments, to think about the relationship to our existence and our existence to the world, is that by putting aside the more goal-oriented approach to life, we put aside the ability to progress more largely as a society. And I know these are slightly different ends, or very different ends, right? The pursuit of individual happiness versus the pursuit of somehow raising the quality of life as society writ large. But I'm curious if you've thought about, whether these two things are in tension, right? The life as a journey, happiness, and then increasing quality of life, increasing progress as society, are those reconcilable or not?
That's a fantastic question. It's something that I've tried to address and that's given me difficulty in the book, because the more you want to emphasize the sense in which life is a never-ending journey, that there isn't any specific goal that life is meant to reach, that includes our greatest social and political goals as well. And I don't mean to try to hide that or diminish that a life devoted to self-possession, friendship, engagement with nature is not a life that is consumed by the ideal of making the world a better place, however one might define that, and that there is a tension that I think is important to recognize between even our greatest goals, whether it's technological innovation, advances in medicine, whether it's political reforms, great social change for the better, that there is a risk that the more we become absorbed in even the greatest goal-oriented activities, the more we lose an appreciation for the virtues that we've been discussing. And I would say that there is nothing inconsistent necessarily between living a life in attention to goals. I mean, goals great and small, we have to pay attention to goals on a daily basis if we want to just put food on the table. We have to have some kind of a goal-oriented approach. And when it comes to greater societal goals, those are very important too. But what I think we should be more skeptical of are grand narratives of historical change that say that our greatest calling as human beings and as agents is to live in service of making the world a better place, because I think that overlooks the way in which there is an inherent instability to life. And I think the ancient Greek tragic sensibility was very attuned to this, and you see it in other religious sources too. Of course, in the Jewish tradition, we have it in the story of Job. There is a kind of tragic sensibility that's important to hold on to, in light of which virtues such as self-possession and friendship matter a great deal, that when things at any moment could fall apart, when disaster strikes, how are you able to cope with that? How are you able to salvage a life that's meaningful and exuberant? And there, I think, having genuine friends and cultivating self-possession really does matter. So it's not that goal-oriented activity is bad. We couldn't live a life without goal-oriented activity. But yes, I think there's an important tension between the two that we have to be mindful of.
Before we call upon Rabbi Baker to bring this gathering to a close, Adam, I wanted to ask you, I imagine people want to hear, before we adjourn, at least some words about how we can, in our lives, achieve happiness if we take your teaching to heart. And I wonder, in that spirit, if I could ask you just to read a passage from the chapter on engagement with nature. Let me just read a sentence that sets it up. You're writing about outdoor sports as one form of engagement with nature, and then you write, simply opening the door in the evening to greet a peaceful sunset does so too. And then if you could tell us how and why, that sentence, and then maybe that passage.
So simply opening the door in the evening to greet a peaceful sunset does so too. It can encourage us to recognize a meaning higher than our achievements and goals. In the crimson sphere of light descending beneath the horizon, in the golden clouds moving quietly toward us, we may encounter the brilliance of a life whose final outpouring is for us, the survivors, to receive and carry on. Or we may meet the end of today's journey, whose last rays, carried our way by the drifting clouds, remind us silently that tomorrow begins the next chapter. The potential for adventure and new life is right there in front of you. Appreciate what lies outside your door and make something of it. Run, walk, climb the highest hill in town and look out onto the horizon. And if that's not enough, run up as fast as you can. Do push-ups till your arms scream. You don't have to do that.
Easy, that's easy for you to say.
Swim in the ocean. Go as far as you can until you're too terrified to go further. Or just lie on the grass and look up at the stars. No one is stopping you. There are 1,000 paths that have never yet been trodden, writes Nietzsche. 1,000 hidden aisles of life. Even now, man and man's earth are unexhausted and undiscovered. A flourishing life is within your reach every day, provided you're willing to step out of your routines and allow the world to announce itself.
Beautiful. So, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to invite Rabbi Mark Baker forward. I just want to give a big thank you also to Anna Weinstein and to Robbie Schinder from the KI team for putting this together, and to Brookline Booksmith for being here with books to sign afterwards. Rabbi Mark Baker, Bavakash.
Thank you. Well, this feels like an unenviable spot to be. I'm mostly just going to close, but thank you too. That was, I think, on behalf of all of us and everyone watching, what an incredible privilege it was, both to learn from you, but also to kind of witness as you started this intergenerational conversation. I don't think it's lost on any of us that this is happening in the middle of the Passover holiday, which in many ways I think is meant to be everything you described about what the original philosophical life was, which is a community and families that have conversations, inquiry, questions, honest pursuit of meaning, especially across the generations. And to see a child teaching their parent on the Passover holiday is just incredibly emotional, meaningful, and reflective of everything I would want my family and my community to be. So thank you so much for that. Let's have a round of applause. Really. Just one word of Torah, because the thing I was thinking about the entire time was a line of Psalms that some of us may know from the song Ivdu et Hashem besimcha, which is a song that says you're supposed to worship God besimcha, with joy and with happiness. And I think there's something counterintuitive about that when you think about religion. It's often, or Judaism, you worship God with guilt, worship God with, a fear, but no, like simcha and happiness or joy, and we could unpack whether it's the same thing or different, is so core, I think, to our spiritual understanding of what the good life is meant to be. And you asked about the philosophical angle on this. I was sitting here thinking about the spiritual angle on this and thinking about the fact that what runs through your three virtues, and clearly your life, Adam, which you clearly got from somewhere, is like a deep sense of being in relationship with something larger than ourself, and being in service of something larger than ourself, whether that be our own growth and development and self-possession, or whether that be the kind of relationships that are authentic and generative and not transactional, or whether that be nature and the world of which we are a part, where we are in this kind of dialogic learning relationship. To me, that's the heart of kind of the Jewish vision of the kind of human beings we aspire to be. And it's at the heart of what I would call like a purposeful, joyful community, which, as Danny said at the beginning, is what this community is all about. And I love that we are having this conversation right now, both during Passover, weeks before we take a huge trip to Israel for an initiative that we're calling Spark, precisely because the whole point of it is not to be an end, but to be the beginning of a journey as a community that is renewing its commitment to learning, as we're doing today, and also to connection and deep relationships, and to purpose, and figuring out what kind of community we're aspiring to build together over this next decade. And I feel like all of you for coming out today, and the two of you for sparking and igniting this learning experience, are part of the creation of a community of joy and happiness, which is, I think, what this book is all about. So thank you both. Thank you all for being here. It should be a meaningful Passover, and hopefully we can all continue to learn and grow and put happiness into action in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you again to everybody. You're more than welcome to purchase books, and Adam will be very delighted to sign them. And thank you, Michael. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Kiku, Aaron, Elena, everybody, Danny, Rabbi Baker. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.